Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I do down here in all these bins and buckets is I compost. I compost household scraps and kitchen waste and things like that. With the help of the worms, I convert all that waste into a good material that's useful for gardening. I guess the other cool thing about all that is the just deviation of all that stuff that would otherwise turn into trash, end up in your garbage pail, and wind up in a landfill somewhere. It just feels like, deviating stuff from the landfill is a noble cause that I like to participate in. So one of the things that I also do is run a bin outside. It's just a compost barrel that's outside where I'm not so particular about what goes in there. It's kind of an anything goes system, and not too long ago I emptied the material out of that system, and there was the worms. There was a whole bunch of worms actually, and I used those worms to launch off a bin that's down there on the ground. And the castings that those worms had left behind was held on to for a while with the assumption that they probably left behind not only castings, but also a whole bunch of their cocoons, just waiting to hatch and release the baby worms. And I guess running a cocoon nursery is not for everyone, that's for sure. In this case, I've given this thing, even if I was like the most patient person in the world, I would already be kind of feeling like, what the heck, it's time to bring this thing to an end, because I don't know. I think that the average understood. I'm assuming that these are red wigglers, by the way, because the worms, that occupy my outdoor compost barrel, I believe are red wigglers. But there again, I didn't populate that outdoor compost barrel. Those worms all made their way into that material on their own, voluntarily. So I'm just guessing that it's red wigglers. But I always thought that the time for a cocoon, red wiggler cocoon at least, to hatch was somewhere between 21 and 23 days. So I think, giving many times that should result in pretty much every cocoon in this being hatched by this time. But then there's still that matter of, well, itsy bitsy tiny worms the size of your eyelash. Well, I wanted to also leave time to let those worms kind of grow. And once they're grown a little bit bigger, I think rounding them up should be a little bit easier too. So that's the whole thing that's going on over here, is an attempt to round up worms that are assumed to have hatched out of the cocoons that were assumed to have been left here by the worms that were vacated from the material. So there are a number of assumptions in place here, which all could have been wrong, resulting in this material having no cocoons and therefore no baby worms. But I just feel like the chance of that being the case is very slim. I've always felt like there's always been a good number of worms cruising around in this stuff. And you can tell just by the size of the worms as I pick them out of the material. They are fairly young. They're all juvenile worms. None of them appear to have that degree of maturity where they could possibly be mating and creating new cocoons of their own. Although that could be untrue as well, I mean, this material has been sitting around for quite some time. And I wouldn't even be surprised if some of the worms that were born in here could already be at that age of maturity where they could also be mating. So it does seem like there are opportunities where you can possibly start with completely worm-free material, let the cocoons all hatch, and then also, as quickly as possible, round up all those worms before they're old enough to start leaving behind cocoons of their own, repeating the cycle. But here again, I've not really tried to keep to that sort of an objective, so there is, I guess, the possibility of this material having a whole bunch of freshly deposited cocoons already in it as well. And it's not a system that I plan to just keep around that way. I want to use these castings. These castings are pretty awesome. In fact, I almost treat these castings as being somehow supercharged in a way, or even better than typical castings like you find in the systems here in my wormery, because this is from my compost barrel, so it's worms breaking the stuff down as well as a whole slew of other creatures, and just the overall time of the material that's been in that compost barrel. I think this system must have ran for a good number of years before I finally got around to harvesting it. And there too I was sort of forced into the need to empty the container because it was splitting, breaking apart, and I just needed to do a repair on the system, and the only way to do so was to empty it. And that led to this harvest of the castings and the relaunch of the system with all the stuff that was still in there, still breaking down. And then just the removal of the worms from the harvested castings is how I ended up with that container of worms on the shelf. And, you know, I guess you could always think of it in terms of, well, these worms really belong outside. You could see it that way if you think, and that was always my intention, was to someday return these worms to the compost barrel, as well as the worms that were already rounded up out of their castings once before we started this cocoon nursery. But every time I check on that outdoor compost barrel, it just seems to me like there's so many worms out there already anyway that these additional worms are, you know, not needed. They would just be overkill, you know, unnecessary, and that just sort of opens the door to the possibility of maybe keeping the worms down here and, you know, having more worms here living in my wormery inside. So definitely cautious. Every time I go through this material, I'm always looking for stuff other than worms that might have come in for a ride while I was doing this. So yeah, I'm just wondering now how to get back on topic here. Well, I guess I'm definitely on topic here, right? Because the topic is, I haven't even announced it, right? Obviously the topic is to round up the worms out of this material so the material could be used for gardening. And what's going on here inside this little plastic container, it's the type of container you buy little cherry tomatoes in at the vegetable market. I loaded it up with fresh bedding, some fruits, I think. I don't remember what it was, maybe apple? I don't even remember what I had used as the food to try to round up worms to lure them into this little box. We started this 28 days ago, 4 weeks ago, and we checked back in 2 weeks in, so that was 2 weeks ago, and now it's 2 weeks further. We did actually replenish the food supply in here, I believe, last time, and from what I remember, we just didn't have a really overwhelming or impressive turnout in the box yet. And I'm just kind of hoping that that's not going to continue to be the situation, because then we would have to sort of write off this whole attempt at rounding the worms up this way as unsuccessful, because I don't know, I just expect more, you know. I would expect to really have the worms really looking to get out of this material because of what we've set out there for them, because it is that, you know, attractive to them, it is that alluring. But if what we're setting up for them isn't really creating that sort of a response and reaction out of the worms, then maybe we need to sweeten the deal, you know. That's the thinking I've got. And that, I don't know, that could just be one piece of the puzzle too, you know. To me, it's also the other incentive worms usually have for leaving material that they're presently occupying is the dampness, or, you know, corresponding dryness, if you will, of the material, being a really good motivator as the stuff starts to dry. And I think that was part of the reason I've just sort of stopped watering this system. For a while I was coming in almost on not a daily basis, every few days, squirting these systems down just to make sure that the moisture level stays hospitable for the, you know, the hatching of cocoons, the rearing of baby worms. But more recently I've been focused more on turning the material into something that the worms would prefer to exit on their own voluntarily. So I think we're just gonna have to call a stop to this me searching for worms individually, because that's really not the aim here. The aim, I guess, is to assess the progress we're making using this present tool and decide whether continuing with it is the best next step. So let me get a tray we could dump this into. So now I guess the decision point here is whether we try to restock this thing and help it continue as is because it's doing such a good job for us, or, you know, just decommission it because it's not really doing the intended job, if that's what we decide is what's going on here. I just want to sort of get a sense of whether all the holes remain clear and open. Some of them seem a little bit blocked, but most of them seem to remain as a clear passageway for the worms to be able to come through. So I guess that's kind of a plus, you know, so it's not sort of degrading to the point where worms just after a while can't even get in. You know, last time we checked this material, we did not see many worms, that's for sure. Oh, here's another one. Let's grab them. And you know, since we've already rounded up this many, you know, I think last time we just left whatever worms had gathered and let the box continue after putting in a little bit more food to help the process continue. But I believe at this point, getting the worms out of here that have so far collected is probably a good idea, and then maybe resetting is a good idea, because it does look like we're actually getting a pretty decent turnout here now. Even though that first check-in a couple weeks ago was a little bit lackluster and unimpressive, it does seem to me like what had been in this box, which was a bunch of paper and leaves, I guess, whatever it is that I had been using in here as bedding, is now 100% castings, other than these little scraps of veggie, which almost seemed like they didn't even have an interest in it. It almost seems like they came in for the fresh bedding, which they obviously don't have any of anymore for some time now, and they just gobbled it all up, every last speck of it. So it does almost seem like the fruits or veggies or whatever it is that you lay out as bait is almost irrelevant. It does almost seem like bedding is all you need. And you know, that's actually the way I started out here. I was trying to mimic the baiting and rounding up process that I had observed on one of these other YouTube channels, actually on the VERMIBAG channel. There had been an attempt to round up worms using nothing other than you know, the homemade bedding that guy Tom creates, and it's got some yummy stuff in it. It's really nice bedding, and it's not surprising. So I don't know if my boring bedding would get the same results, but it does certainly seem like they've done a number on what bedding had been put in here for them. So I guess a reset would just consist of fresh bedding and maybe just returning a couple of these yummy snacks back into the box to serve as potential alternative, you know, attractant. But it does also seem to me like what's really attracting them, or at least what's piquing their interest in terms of what to eat, is the bedding. So I'll have to get my prepared bedding, what little bit I have left. I'm going to have to make some more. But these little guys, I guess we can reunite them with their colony over in that bin that I started. So that's pretty cool. Let's set these aside just so we can do a quick reset here, and then we'll move on to releasing worms. I really am pleased to see how nicely things are going in here. Yeah, you can see I'm running a little bit low on my supply, but it's plenty for restocking a container this big. And we don't need much, but you know what? Instead of just taking the stuff as is dry, I think it'll be about a handful we'll need. I've got this little container here, leftovers from what I was doing yesterday. I've been using this stuff in all my systems, and we're going to use it here too, I guess, as the moisture content. It's a solution of that Mosquito Dunks solution, that Mosquito Dunks BTI solution. So instead of just using plain old boring water, I figured we use some of this stuff, which would help in ensuring that we don't end up with gnats and stuff moving into this material, although it seems like there's nothing going on in here as far as gnats and fruit flies or whatever is concerned, but I have been seeing them in some of my systems, so I didn't want this to be a contributor to any sort of a problem. So I think that moisture that we just added, oops, it's still pouring out. I just want to make sure it soaks all into this bedding material. I guess if a little bit remains fluid and drains out the bottom, it's not the end of the world. It'll just sort of be the dinner bell ringing, letting the worms down in the material know that there's a nice damp place to come to. Because you know, the moisture in here is not just cozy and cool for them to hang out in, it's vital for their breathing, because worms don't have lungs. They bring in the oxygen that their bodies need through the moisture that touches their skin. So they need to surround themselves with nice damp materials at all times to breathe. So, you know, it's fairly important stuff, you know, damp material for them to have at their disposal. And if they're not in it, if they're not in material that's nice and damp, they're going to sense that they're in materials that's, you know, potentially dangerous for them to be in. And they're going to get moving, looking for something a little bit better. And I think we've actually, you know, gotten to that point where this material has finally dried out to the degree where it's not, you know, certainly not dangerous for worms to be in. Not by any means, but it's also not perfectly damp either. So any worms, I guess, at this point sort of happening upon our little baiting station, sensing the moisture, are most likely going to enter and take interest. And also the bedding, you know, the carbon food source is also another important thing. There's very little remaining of out here in the system at large. So that's why they're coming in and staying, because there's stuff for them to eat. So this is good. I'm glad it's working. I really was hoping that we wouldn't have to sort of shut this down and come up with the plan B. But it is taking a little longer than I expected. But it is also a lot of material, a good amount of material in here. So I'm just going to continue with the whole thing of not moistening this stuff any further, letting it continue to dry from the outside in. And the worms will hopefully start zeroing in on what we've set up as a little oasis for them in here. So what's next? Aha! I know what it is. Back to releasing our collected worms. So let's go get the bin that we're going to move these little guys into, and we'll get them situated. Alright, here we go. Here's the system. It's out here on the bench already, and just a matter of releasing our worms. It's funny, I had this system out on the bench just the other day because we were celebrating its 100th day birthday. It's been in service for over 100 days now, and it's high time that we started rounding up the worms that belong with this population, the ones that came out of the cocoons that these wormies left behind. So just rolling things aside here so we have a good surface to place our little friends onto. They could go right down into the bedding. They wouldn't be obstructed by any of this paper on top. So let's go ahead and get these guys released. So as I always do, I'm always looking for people's feedback on how many worms we've got in here. I've already got feedback on the worms that we initially launched this bin with. So I guess we'll just add whatever worms we add now to that total. I think it was 928 that we've got in here, although we've been pretty skeptical as to whether that number's even true or not. So let's go ahead and release these guys now, and we'll be done. Got a couple stuck to the plastic here. They're kind of mixed in with those beautiful castings they created inside that plastic box. So the castings are going to obstruct our view of them, and they are pretty puny because most of them are still juveniles. So let's let them get situated, and then we'll be done. Well, that went pretty quick. You know, these little guys, they weren't really, like when you have a big, huge bundle of adult worms, they're all wind into each other. It seems like it takes a while for them to just sort of detach from each other. And they can sort of become individuals again. But here, they were all still kind of, you know, scattered within this nice castings material that they created over in their bait box. And it seemed like they all had pretty easy access to the material right below them. So I used a little bit more of this BTI Mosquito Dunks solution to rinse out those few bits of bedding that we had in this container. So I'm going to use those to revamp the application of BTI in this system here. I only had this system out a day or two ago to celebrate the 100th day of this system here. And now, you know, 100 some odd days later, we're adding more worms. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone thinks in terms of how many worms we got here. So let's get this thing covered up because we're done. And I guess I'll be back into that cocoon nursery a couple weeks from now just to see what we're getting as far as further progress on rounding up the babies in there. But I guess the story continues over there. And hopefully soon we'll be able to get to use those castings, but maybe not quite yet. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.